and welcome to our Wednesday webinar, Interpreting Challenging Text, brought to you by Grand Canyon University and the Canyon Professional Development Team. Our special guest at this time is Benton Trerise, the Program Development Specialist representing the College of Theology. So welcome, Benton.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
So we always like to start off with an inspirational quote or a piece of scripture that really sets the stage for our webinar. And you've chosen this one. Would you please read it to us and share why you thought this was fitting?
Absolutely. So this is from 2 Timothy 2:15, and it says, "Be diligent to present yourself approved to God, a worker who does not need to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." I feel this was relevant to the population that we're speaking to. I know that everyone is working hard all the time to serve their populations. And so I felt like this was helpful in that realm. I feel like if we are diligent to present ourselves well to the work we have at hand, and we aren't ashamed of what we're doing, then we can rightly divide or teach the word of truth. That word basically means cut in a straight line. So we're dividing exactly what we're trying to identify. So I felt it was relevant to our topic today, as well as to the careers of many of our viewers.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Our overall goals as we go through our topics in interpreting challenging text are identifying and understanding socio-historical context, and that word historical was kind of new for me, using genre to approach the text, something I haven't enjoyed doing in the past, and recognizing how personal context affects interpretation. So I think these are really interesting. And when you and I were speaking and preparing for this, you brought up something really interesting, a book by Joel Green called Seized by Truth, and had some really, I think, powerful ways to frame how to get into the text. You want to tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, so essentially, Joel Green in his book wants to help divide different atmospheres that we can approach a text to help us with interpretation. Essentially, the idea behind it, we have to understand what is going on with a particular text, both behind the scenes, what's going on in the text, such as genre, and then what's happening with ourselves as we approach the text. The idea is kind of, give an analogy, when we receive mail and it's addressed to us, we know who it's coming from, and we know who it's intended to be written to. And when we open it, we can often identify what the intent behind it is. If we were to open someone else's mail, we wouldn't be able to read it with the right frame of mind necessarily, because it's not addressed to us. We may not know who the person that wrote it is exactly, and therefore the message contained within may not make as much sense. It's, if you've ever accidentally received an email from someone that wasn't supposed to be sent to you, right? You're kind of like, what is this? I don't even understand what this is supposed to be for. It's the same kind of idea.
I really like that analogy too. That was pretty powerful to me about, when we're reading the text, we need to be reading it as it speaks to us. And oftentimes we're approaching text as it's somebody else's, it's external to us. And so a very powerful analogy. Thank you. Yeah. So we're going to go ahead and dissect these three down, and you're going to help us understand a little bit better how to do this. So first, we're going to walk into behind the text. And to get behind the text, you have this term socio-historical context. Hard for me to say and a little difficult for me to wrap my mind around. So tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Socio-historical context speaks to what is going on behind the scenes of the particular text that we are identifying. When we want to understand what we are approaching in the first place, why the text came about, what the intention behind it was, why it was written. And so the more we can understand about what was going on in society and history at that time, the context surrounding the author, essentially, the better we can understand the text and what the meaning of it is. And so having a better understanding then of the author, who they were, their upbringing, their career, their relationships, all of those things will help us better understand who the author is and why they were writing in the first place.
So thinking about authors, we could be talking about Plato. We could be talking about authors of books of the Bible. We could be talking about an author of a scientific research paper. So
Exactly, right. So the way I'm going to approach something written by Socrates is going to be different than if I'm approaching a biblical text. It's going to be different than approaching a scientific research paper. Understanding who the author is in each of those situations helps us better understand what they were writing, right? If I want to read something by Shakespeare, generally his context and what he is doing in his life is different than what was going on in Socrates, both in a literal sense in time of history and also in their personal lives.
Sure. And you had used that analogy of the mail. And I really like that with the audience, especially if we're talking to students. You know, if we say mail that like came in an envelope, they may not understand what we're talking about, but an email, well, that might not even connect to them, but it could even be a text.
Text.
You know, who is the text to? Have you ever received a text that wasn't meant for you?
Right. And you respond, who is this?
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So how might understanding the audience also change?
Yeah. So if I understand that, so I'll use a biblical example in this case. If I understand that Paul, for the book of Ephesians, is writing to the church in Ephesia, then I know what is going on in their context in addition to what's going on in Paul's context. So I can then look at the socio-historical context for the audience and have a better understanding of why they might be receiving this particular letter and or piece of text or whatever it is. Shakespeare, for example, his audience was more for entertainment, right? That was sort of who he was seeking in his audience. And so understanding that helps us better understand why they wrote what they wrote.
Absolutely. And then also thinking about, you had mentioned before Anne Frank, and if we're thinking about global events, you know, thinking about the global events occurring while Anne Frank is writing versus when Shakespeare was writing, what might we have to do to really understand that?
Exactly. When we read Anne Frank's diary, we know that she was living the Holocaust. She was living the war. And so that was a major global event that affected her, that led her to write what she wrote. So understanding that global event and the particulars behind that helps us better understand why she wrote what she wrote and what some of the meaning behind what she wrote is. And so same thing, whenever we're trying to identify difficult text and what's going on, it's important to see what kind of important global events were happening at the time to better understand the text. For the Bible, that's often understanding what was going on with the church at large during that time. Sometimes it was persecution by the Roman Empire. Understanding that helps us better understand why they wrote what they wrote and why we need to be reading it in a particular way.
Thank you. So that's behind the text. So that makes no sense. Now I have to go behind the scenes, kind of think about it that way. And then the next step you brought up was getting in the text. And when we get in the text, there's really a decision. Seems simple, but it's an important decision you have to make here, right?
Yeah, essentially, we need to know when we're in the text, when we're approaching a text, we need to understand what the entire text is, as well as what the individual passage from that a particular sentence is coming from. We're going to approach things slightly differently if we're wanting to, identify the entire text versus a passage of the text. And so if we're wanting to understand what the intention was, what was going on with the whole text, that socio-historical context becomes much more important. Whereas a passage, we can look at literal context of the passage that we're pulling from and reading before and after that passage.
It's interesting. I hadn't really thought of it that way. I just thought if I'm dealing with a passage, I'm just dealing with the whole book. And so that's a really good point there. And so one of the, I don't know, assignments or activities a student might get would be to identify the genre. Okay, so what do you have to do first to identify the genre?
Yeah, exactly. So in identifying genre is an important piece of interpreting difficult texts. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So in order to help us know what the genre is, we have to identify what is the story being written, what is the plot that is occurring in the text, who are the characters, and what are the setting. All of these pieces, for my English teachers out there, help determine what the genre is. And so if we can split out each of these pieces, then we can better identify what the genre is. And that goes a long way in helping us interpret a text, like we'll talk about here in a second.
So before I ask you the question of like, who cares? because I know as a student, I didn't care about identifying the genre. These really sound like they're for for fictional text, but I think those could also apply for nonfiction, right? I mean, I always just associate them with stories.
No, I definitely think they can. Now, obviously, in nonfiction, some of these things aren't going to be as prevalent, right? Like you may not necessarily have an overarching character that is throughout the whole nonfiction piece. But knowing who the characters that are brought up can still be important. Knowing in that case, it may not be plot, but it may be message. What is the message being written in the nonfiction piece? These are still important pieces that can help us identify genre, even in nonfiction texts.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. Appreciate that. So I'm going to go back to my who cares, because I never really enjoyed doing this. So why do I want to do this?
Yeah, who cares? Well, great question. If I am going to read Socrates and his philosophical writings, I'm going to approach that in one way, with one mindset, with one understanding, versus if I'm going to read Shakespeare and his plays, I'm going to approach that with a totally different mindset and a totally different understanding. I'm not going to go to Shakespeare and assume that he's trying to make overt philosophical reasonings in his text, although certainly that was part of his plays. But ultimately, he was desiring to entertain, to provide some at least conversation pieces. Whereas with Socrates, we can read his writings a little more literally, right? He generally meant exactly what he was writing. And so the mindset that we have when approaching the text alters greatly when we understand what the genre is.
Okay. So now we've gone behind the text, we've gone in the text, and now we're about to jump out in front of the text, which I couldn't even, before you explained this to me, I really had no idea what this meant. I thought behind and in the text was enough. So, but then after you explained it, it really made, kind of light bulb moment here. Tell me about in front of the text.
So I think that understanding what is going on in front of the text is just as important as what's going on behind and in the text. Each and every one of us has a personal context that we have experienced. We each have different upbringings, we have different societal experiences, we have different relationships, we have different parent experiences. Understanding our own personal context, our own story for connection here, understanding all of that helps us better approach a text appropriately. We want to kind of differentiate, what am I bringing to the text that's causing me to interpret it one way versus what did the author intend initially in his writing of the text. So better understanding of my own worldview and understanding how that applies to the world around me and then the text I'm approaching better helps me approach the text.
When you see this term personal context, sounds like bias, and bias is a word we use a lot kind of in education, which often comes with a negative context. So is that really, do we have to think about it that way?
I prefer to use personal context when talking about interpreting text because of some of the negative connotation around bias. I feel like it's not a bad thing that we each have lived our own different lives and have different experiences. What's important is knowing what my personal context is understanding my worldview. If I can understand what those items are, then I can better approach things both objectively and subjectively. If I can better split apart my own worldview from what the text might be saying in the first place. So I choose to say personal context because I feel like the negative connotation behind bias doesn't apply in the situation. It's just better understanding myself so that I can approach the text in the right way.
I really like that reframing of it, because I think this is probably one of the most important parts of reading challenging text or any text, is to understand that and to understand that we are all unique and we all bring our personal perspectives, and that's valuable, but we have to understand how to recognize it. I really like that. And that's not just for stories. I mean, that's even for nonfiction. That's even, my mind goes to science writing because that's my background. I have a personal context even when I read a scientific journal.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and we have a personal context when we read a piece of news. We all approach and interact with news in a different way. If we just were to take a step back and recognize our personal context, understand what my worldview is, I might be able to engage in conversation with other people about current events in a much more meaningful and direct way.
Valuable lesson we need to be teaching how to be media consumers by just recognize our personal context. So thank you for that. The last thing was some tools, like how do we get to this point where we can interpret what's going on behind or inside the text? And so if you'll just tell us a little bit about the tools you think of using.
Absolutely. So, it's not like we can pick up a play by Shakespeare and he's going to have a personal biography about his life and all the global events that were going on and then directly tell us what the genre is. So using these tools help us identify those pieces that we've talked about today. So the first place you can start is a biography about the author. If you can find a biography about the author, that's going to explain a lot of the things we talked about in regards to who the author was, what kind of major global events were going on in their lives, and perhaps the audience that they were even writing to on a regular basis. If they were a well-known writer, then that's probably going to be a good part of the biography. And then apart from that, there's often academic journals that cover texts in various degrees. And so being able to go online even and just researching some academic journals that have been written about your particular book or passage can help frame things and give you some more information related to the things we talked about, and even helping identify genre a little bit easier. Editorial reviews of a book go a long way towards that as well. They'll often break out what the genre is and what the intention of the author was in the first place and kind of take care of some of those steps for you. And then apart from those things, academic essays can go a long way in explaining a lot of that too, as they've done the research in biographies, academic journals, and editorial reviews and present some of the information we talked about in regards to sociohistorical context genre.
As you were going through those and you're discussing that other people wrote all of these items to help you, I couldn't help but kind of reflect on the previous in front of the text. I have to remember that personal context was used to write each of these. So boy, that muddies the water, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I can. So we've talked about my knowledge of scripture and how that's come into play here. Everyone knows how many different opinions there are about scripture. So understanding who the author is in those cases can go a long way in helping frame what they're writing and what they're intending by their writing.
A lot to think about here. Some pretty big picture things to think about. I have a few tools that I like to use in the classroom, and we're going to share that with the audience. I know once students have read and done their analysis, that a really important part of conceptualizing the reading is to share with others and actually have a discussion, right? And a verbal discussion is very different than a written discussion. So I like to have stems because many times students don't have the right words to really frame a discussion, and it can become very personal. So providing them with stems really helps them have an academic discussion and keep it about the topic and not about the person. These stems that we have will be available in the show notes down below. The ones that I'm showing you here are more middle high school level, but I do have a elementary school version too that you can link to in the document. So a little more simple. But even when I'm doing workshops with teachers, sometimes I'll use stems just to get us going and keep us on track. Another tool beyond the discussion is then reflecting, like how do I reflect metacognitively about what I've read and how I've interpreted the text. And so a menu can be really helpful, giving students choice about how to reflect and making sure that those questions on your menu are really open-ended, giving them choice, not being content specific. Like for instance, this reflection menu could be used with pretty much any text. There's a few here that might be for fiction, but simply how have you improved as a reader by reading the book? That's a big question. And I really like students to reflect on their reading, not only the content, but their experience as a reader.
That can greatly inform your personal context and worldview as well, these questions.
Oh, yeah. So go back to, wait, is that behind the text? Yeah, that's behind the text. In front of the text. Yeah. Just get in the text. That's the point here. And as we wrap up, I'd like to remind you why we do what we do. Like Grand Canyon University and Benton and Canyon Professional Development are here to support you. We want to empower, educate, and inspire our community, and that's you, so you can take action to fulfill your purpose and serve others. Please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more free PD, hundreds of videos. Thank you, and thanks again for coming today, Benton.
Yes, of course. Thank you, and thank you all.